Taylor
That's right.
is a producer and screenwriter known for her work on Hope Springs, the first Divergent film, Alias, Game of Thrones, and now Shape of Water, for which she's been nominated for an Academy Award. By the way, how many of you guys have seen Shape of Water? How many? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, awesome. Her next project, by the way, is Aladdin, to be directed by Guy Ritchie. As a child, Vanessa wrote fairy tales, if I can believe anything I've read about you on the internet now. In high school, she attended Interlochen in Michigan, which is crazy for me because I went to Cranbrook, also in Michigan.
Oh my God, sure,
Yeah.
sure.
So, Vanessa, I'd also like to introduce to you this community of mythology and depth psychology alumni from Pacifica Graduate Institute. You've already met some of these students here with me, and here from the studio school. And also here with us is Dana White, a graduate of Pacifica's Myth program, who you know well, and Dara Marks, a mythologist and leading script consultant and friend of the Myth Salons. Game of Thrones and Shape of Water are a couple of the most mythological, symbolic, and psychological productions in recent memory. Shape of Water is an extremely exciting film for a depth psychologist or a mythologist. It's an honor to have you here. Hopefully we can get lost in the deep end with you tonight. So I wanted to start, just break the ice with a question. So I read that you wrote fairy tales as a child. Did working on this film, Shape of Water, bring back childhood memories? Was it a flashback experience?
You know, it was really interesting when I first heard, I entered into this process of this script sort of far along into the process of the story itself, because our director and my co-writer, Guillermo del Toro, had been working on this for some time. And so the process was that he asked to meet with me. He wanted to tell me this idea. And he started talking, and he said it took place in 1962. And so I was really thinking, okay, so it's this period piece. And then at a certain point, I realized, oh, it's a fairy tale, which was surprising to me, I think, simply because of that period element. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I thought, oh, I get it. I really get what he wants to do. And I had, you know, various encounters with fairy tales along the way, and honestly, not all successful at all. I actually had many, right at the very beginning of my trying to work on the feature film side of the business, I had adapted actually one of my favorite books of all time, which was a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. And that just went nowhere. And then they obviously made the Disney version of Beauty and the Beast, which is quite different. So yeah, you know, I feel like I've had many, many different encounters with fairy tales, but I find them still quite challenging, which is funny because you think of them as being simple and also complex because they have psychological depth. But the thing about this being a fairy tale was that I felt like it kind of gave us license to do anything we wanted. To me, it was very freeing to know it was a fairy tale, because initially I was very concerned with everything being authentic to the period and everything being properly, it's about the military and these generals and who, I was very concerned with the hierarchy of all these military people and whose title was what. And when I sort of more embraced the fairy tale aspect, I was like, oh, who cares? Like, that's really not very important. That's really not what this is about.
So that really was a big part of how it clicked in for you, was seeing it as a
yeah,
fairy tale. Wow.
Absolutely. And just suddenly having the understanding of like, oh, I really get what this guy is going for. I really understand. Because he had a super specific vision of this. It was very personal to him. Like I said, he had been working on it for some time. And so it was important that whoever came on board with him really, really got what he was trying to do, because he was so far along in his process, and he needed or wanted a partner. But to me, getting the tone of it properly and getting onto the same page and trying to write the movie he wanted to write was obviously the most important.
So there, what I definitely wanted to try and avoid was asking too many questions where you would be forced to say, well, that was something that Del Toro did. So one of the things I found when I was looking through some of the interviews with you, somebody asked you this question and you responded by saying that one of the things you really provided was the structure in a lot of ways. And so I wanted to see if Dara wanted to help me ask you about structure, because this is what she does. Yeah, would love to hear more about, well, yeah, especially with Tara, wanted to ask you.
I have to just really start by complimenting you. I mean, it is
Oh,
just
thank you.
a beautiful film.
Thank you.
Just a beautiful, beautiful film. My husband is very used to going to the movies with me, and then afterwards, of course, we have to take it apart.
Right.
And I left. No, seriously, I left the movie saying, "We're not going to touch this one. This is just.
Oh,
this
that's
just.
so sweet.
This just really works.
That's
it really
nice.
does." And it's because the movie had a sense of itself. And so, one of the things that I have found when I've worked with collaborations is that one of the hurdles that collaborators have to get over is getting into the same story.
Mm-hmm.
That very often they can be both brilliant, both writing something wonderful, but there are thematic elements
Yeah.
that then pull them into telling of the same story. Was there anything for you in your process where like it was a big aha I'm hearing when you just even realized that you were doing a
Yeah.
fairy tale? But were there other elements that as a collaborator that kind of really brought you two together and made
Yeah.
this? Because I mean, collaborations are very difficult, and this one
Yeah.
seemed to work beautifully.
Well, I think there are several aspects. First of all, so I think a strength Guillermo has, first of all, he knew his story and what he wanted to do as a director. He's so visually adept. And so I think he knew, somebody has to be in charge.
Yeah.
It's very hard, I think, in partnerships where you're truly equals.
Yeah.
And I admire those partnerships. I've never really been in one. But in this case, he was obviously our captain, and I was sort of... and he knew what he needed from a partner. So I think he kind of had an awareness that he had certain elements he really loved, but that he needed help in certain other areas. I think, there was a phone call early on, and this is sort of what I referred to already, but where I was trying to, we had already been sending pages back and forth. I was kind of locking into a tone, which I think is the most important thing. Are we sounding the same? Is it the same story as you're referring to? And we had this phone call because I wanted to clarify all these things, and I started asking all these very specific questions. Who's this guy, and where did he come from? And very quickly I realized, Guillermo had no interest in this. I was really killing his buzz. This was a ticket to getting fired. This was not why he brought me here.
Okay.
And so very quickly I was like, oh, this isn't how he works. He wants, I think, a person who is willing to be brave in the sense that they're willing to offer up scenes that may or may not make sense, may or may not end up in the movie, but to offer the same level of creativity he was bringing to it, the same sort of fantastical elements, the same just sort of risk-taking.
Yeah.
Hey, maybe this would be cool, or maybe it wouldn't, I don't know. And so I realized from that point, that's what I'm going to bring, and that's how we're going to interact in this. And so I really made it a point to try to match his level of sort of whimsy and creativity around it. And sometimes, seriously, I would submit scenes where I was like, don't even know why this is here. But I think it's sort of interesting. Maybe he'll think it's interesting. And he told me early on, I put something in. I had some of the spies meeting in a Chinese restaurant, and he changed it to a Russian restaurant. And he was like, look, I wanted a Russian restaurant, but I wouldn't have put it as a restaurant at all. So bring whatever you bring, and I'll take what I need, There also, at a certain point, he talked about, and I love this from the very beginning, so the idea that there's these two people in the middle of the story who don't speak, but they have the most authentic communication and the clearest communication. And then everyone else around them is talking and talking and talking, but not really saying very much. And part of the reference he used was Coen Brothers movies, where the talk is very distinctive, but sometimes is, again, sort of people not saying what they mean or circling something. And I really felt like I understood what he meant tonally. And so that was a real moment of like, oh, I get that. We're going to have all this talk that is kind of decorative, and then we're going to have the actual communication in the middle, which is silent. And so that also, it was interesting because when I first told my dad about this project, he's a huge film buff, he loves Guillermo, and he was like, well, this sounds great, except you've got these two main characters who don't talk. It's impossible. And I was like, Dad, you're not getting it. That's like the best part of the whole thing. That's the best part. He was like, I don't know. So yeah, that to me, I really understood what and he asked me to watch a film. It was, why am I not, Llewyn Davis, the Coen Brothers movie about the folk singer. And it's not really similar, but there was something tonally about it that I understood why he was, and it was also the period it was set, I think, in the same year or 1 year apart. But there were certain points like that where I just felt like, oh, okay, I see. And it was pretty quickly, like I said, I think the first 20 pages I submitted, the next time I read them, because we kept going back and forth, I thought, this isn't quite what he's doing. But by the next time, I felt like our pages sound very similar. You could interchange them.
So one of the things I'm hearing is that this pushed you in ways you hadn't quite worked before.
Yeah.
Do you think it's transformed your own process a bit? Being
I
sort
do.
of thrown into this vortex?
I think in a couple different ways. In one way, because I was such a stickler about all these things, and it was not just about the specificity of, the period or whatever, or the military, but about structure.
Yeah.
I was very, and I think I'm very, I come from the American culture of filmmaking. I'm not a big scholar of world cinema. I just don't have that experience or background. And so I think I bring a distinctly, American films tend to have these similarities across films that I was trying to impose on this film. And I think ultimately unsuccessfully, which is probably for the best. And I think it forced me to be a little more flexible about it. I would make changes that were very specifically to make it fall into the American model of how movies work in terms of arc and causality. And he would change it. And I'd be like, well, I guess we don't need that. I guess that's really not important here. And I also think, and I'm really embarrassed about this part of it, as I said, he knew what he needed. I'm sure he got what he needed from me. But in one particular way, I wish I had been a better collaborator. And that is that Guillermo is a pure romantic, I think. And it's a very romantic film, I think, and very many sort of romantic elements. And from the very beginning, he wanted a voiceover. He wanted it to sound kind of fairy tale-like. He wanted a poem at the end. And I was just relentless in my attempts to cut this stuff from the movie. I was like, we don't need a voiceover. I don't understand what information we're imparting. We're just saying that he knows a woman, and I don't know, I just don't get it. And I don't really get this poem, and I just was, because that's my sensibility. I don't have that romanticism, and ultimately, obviously, he kept the voiceover he wanted, and he changed the poem at the end from the one I had read and cut so many times to one that I actually thought was beautiful and really well suited to the film. And he also changed the opening voiceover to something that I thought added a lot more value to the film than what I had been reading initially, which just felt like a tonal thing. It was like, once upon a time there was a thing, or whatever, and this voiceover that we ended up with, I think, was useful in telling you this is Beauty and the Beast, but it's going to be a different version than you think, sort of. But I felt like I was so quick to sort of judge based on, I know what good writing is, and I know what is spare, and I know what is... And I wasn't paying enough attention to, what is his vision and what is this film? Good writing is not always the same. Sometimes it's specific to what this thing is. And I think this movie would have been a lot less had I succeeded in convincing him that these things were not necessary.
One of the reasons I asked about process is because from what you're describing, one of the strengths of American filmmaking is clarity, and when American filmmaking is done very well, it has a very strong body to it, a very, very strong sense of itself. But in teaching it and in practicing it, what we can lose along the way is kind of the risk taking and the high wire act that great creativity really needs. And that's why I was asking if it really impacted your process, because it sounds like you were thrown back into that, and we forget how valuable that is, how valuable it is to just to run with an impression and see where that's
Well, and
taking
I
you.
also think, so American audiences have expectations based on the films they've already seen. If you follow that formula, they know where you're going. Duh, right? But if you're willing to sort of be like, I'm not going left, even though you think I am, now they don't know where you're going. So that's more interesting. So I do think in certain ways, it was really hard for me to let go of some of those elements as we were working. I was like, I don't understand. I kept trying to make the main character. So in all of his versions, she starts out and she's cheerful. She's into sort of doing little dances to the stuff she's seen on the television. And I was like, I don't understand why she's so happy. If she's going to meet this guy, she has to have a lack, right? If she's so thrilled in the first place, why does she need to meet anyone? But that's a very American perspective. She didn't need a lack. He wanted her to be who she was and encounter someone else and be transformed in some ways.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because it felt to me like a very, very strong arc, because it felt to me like a real deep study in loneliness.
Well, I don't know the answer. I mean, truthfully, I kept trying to make her more lonely. And I don't think he wanted that.
Well, I'm not saying just her character. I think
Yes,
everyone in the
absolutely.
whole cast.
Well, I mean, obviously
was
he meant it to
omnipresent.
be about outsiders and marginalized people,
right.
and I think that you saw that.
Yeah.
But I think in her particular character, although she is an outsider, I don't think she started off particularly sort of downtrodden or feeling beleaguered by it. She was an outsider who was sort of okay with being an outsider, and it was interesting to witness my own perception where I was just so wedded to the idea that, like, let's make her sad, let's make her really, and I don't know, it was sort of an intriguing, obviously Guillermo is neither American, nor does he have my limited perspective in terms of, I studied writing. He has studied film globally, so he has a much, much deeper perspective, and he also is a historian of film. I mean, he really has a wide perspective of it all the way from its inception as an art form, whereas I'm sort of catching up to that.
From what I understand, he also has a deep interest in mythology, and that
He's a super erudite guy.
Yeah.
I mean, he really, his references are so wide.
Yeah.
There's no way I could ever have sort of caught up to it, so I had to only offer what I had to offer, which was a pretty decent knowledge of structural mechanics. But it was odd sometimes as I came further into the process, to understand how much of his process I didn't understand. And as I read later articles about all the film references in the movie, which of course I didn't get them all. Like I haven't seen all those films, and it's pretty humbling. And you're still trying to, like, okay, but I'm hired for a job. Like, I got to offer what I have to offer, even though I'm aware that I am not this person's equal.
So you had the experience of the protagonist, an encounter with the other, mysterious
definitely.
other that drew you deep into.
That is for sure. He is the mysterious other. He is a really, really intriguing, and I'm not going to say unique because I haven't worked broadly enough in the industry. Perhaps there are filmmakers who are similar to him. I really don't know, but in my experience, unique in his sort of the purity of his creative vision. I just have not often encountered a person who seemed so unencumbered with all the sort of BS and constraints that come with doing this kind of work in Hollywood. He really just seemed utterly like, whatever, I don't care.
So I'm just coming back from Amsterdam, where I taught at a graduate program, and the most insightful moment of the week, I was asked to teach the hero's journey, and I was asked by a teacher that wanted me to teach the hero's journey, but the artists, these theater artists, they were very resistant to structure. And so finally, the last day, one of the guys, he's from Brazil, took a glass of water, and he said, because he was struggling to speak, and so he used his visual, his images really successfully, and he poured water until it overflowed. And this became the most insightful moment for me for the entire week. And I'm wondering what it was like for you to have this tension between a desire to give structure, but his constant overflowing the structure, constant. And I'm wondering if that dance, if you feel like that dance itself was really productive.
Well, I do think it probably was. I think I ultimately did give structure in the places where, like, there was a certain moment where I was like, okay, this is not going to make sense. Like, it has to, at the very least, make sense. I need for the script to, like, you've got to be able to follow the beats of the story. Mm-hmm. So that's, I'm imposing those here. You know, you can toss them, but I'm telling you, you need them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was, what was the question? Sorry.
Actually, I can't help it. I want to ask you, jumping off what you just said, were any of those beats that you used inspired by the hero's journey? Is that something you've ever worked with?
Of course. I mean, I think everyone, most screenwriters, it's interesting. So the hero's journey is a super, super useful template for a particular kind of story. Mm-hmm. There was a time when I thought it was a useful template for every story. I now think that is not true. You really have to know what story you're telling. And so if you're really lucky, you can use that template and you've got a quest story that makes sense, and that's a really great template because it works. Mm-hmm. And if you can latch onto it, it'll work over and over and over again. As long as you follow those basic sort of points, you're going to make it. There are stories, I think, that don't want to follow that template, and then you're going to struggle more. Mm-hmm.
Was this one of those stories where you wanted it to maybe some of the structure you wanted to impose and some of the resistance, was it around any of those elements?
Yeah, I mean, again, I wanted this kind of arcing for her, and I wanted, and you know, so it was both at the beginning and at the end. I wanted that, I wanted to make her sort of lonelier and lacking, to give her somewhere to go. Mm-hmm. And then I wanted to give her more resistance to returning the creature. I wanted her to have her own issues with, now I've found love and I can't let go. And I tried to give her all these things that, again, in a traditional American film, you would have seen.
And you ended up with only the artist saying, let's keep him for a while.
Right, which was absolutely, like, I had her being sort of in a way that would make you doubt her for a minute, I think. And some of the areas where I did fixes stuck that just were necessary for basic story points. But in other places, he didn't need them. The one thing I like to think, and I could be totally wrong, I like to think the fact that I cut this poem at the end like 500 times. I was just, it's so ridiculous because he's the director. He can put it back. But my commitment was, I'm going to tell him the truth. And our communication was not, phone or Skype or email. Our communication was through the script. So that was the only chance I had to tell him. And so I was saying like, no, no, no. And I just hated this poem so much. And when I finally saw the first cut I saw, and he had put in this great poem, I was like, okay, I didn't pick the great poem. But perhaps the fact that I hated the first poem so much, like he somehow was open to the idea of this new thing. So I hope so. Who knows? Who knows?
Well, clearly it was a collaboration that worked. And I think, you were always looking at a collaboration for different strengths. And it does sound, like
complimentary.
I kept wondering, because in the beginning he made it sound like he wanted a partner because this was going to be in very vernacular English of a certain time period. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. You're not a native English speaker. I get it. And after reading one draft of his material, I was like, no, it doesn't actually make sense. Like, he doesn't have any issues with English. I think I changed one or two words ever. So then I was like, why am I here? Like, what is my purpose here? It was an interesting process of trying to figure it out as I went along, because I was like, he kind of seems fine. And there was a part of me that felt like, this is a guy who needs a workout partner. Like, he needs that other person to show up. I mean, there's a real for me, I have a friend who reads all the material I ever write. And just saying to him, hey, could you read something on Thursday? Gives me the impetus to get to those pages Thursday. And sometimes I feel like Guillermo just needs or wants a partner to like be that other, but I don't know.
How do you feel about the public response to this film? Are you surprised?
Oh my God. I guess in the sense that when it first came my way, the way I sort of heard about it was like, oh, this is this passion project for this director, and you know, it's going to be made at a lower budget than his other stuff, and it's going to be more similar to his first, you know, to Pan's Labyrinth and to Devil's Backbone. And I think some of my representatives were sort of like, well, this doesn't seem very high profile, and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, I really love it, and I love him, and so I'm going to do it. I think there's a great opportunity to do great work, and I don't really care. And it wasn't great pay, it wasn't, you know, and I was like, I don't care. So coming out of that, to have it then be this incredibly high profile thing, where they're all like, oh, yay, you know, like that part was sort of surprising, where I was like, oh, that's funny. Like this was just going to be this project I did because I really, truly wanted to, and I thought I could learn from him, of course. And so yeah, that part. And I guess also, of course, no one could have anticipated, you know, the mood of our country right now. You never can when you start a project. And I think had the mood not been so dark in our political culture, perhaps the response would have been different. Like I think it's a moment when people are really looking for something that is sincere and not cynical or ironic. And you know, there's always that confluence of the material and the moment it's received, and I could never have anticipated that, of course.
Yeah. You know, I one of the things in all my work with writers throughout my experience that I have really come to see, and it's a very specific thing, a very mythic thing, is that we don't just write stories, but stories write us. That there's always something we are coming to know, you know, as we are in the experience, and that it's really a collaboration between the writer's consciousness and the unknown, and the unknowable, and you're coming into relationship with that. And I agree with what you just said. I think it has. It is so in opposition to so many things that are going on in the culture right now that it just stands out as a really elegant portrait of you know, the kind of the beauty of the beast that we're not seeing, we're not touching, we're not feeling, and this works is just really wonderful. It felt as though, because this film felt very intuitive, and that it wasn't intentional, but that all of the male characters, including the ones we're sympathetic with, like the artist, were very lost and or desperate souls.
Yeah,
you
I
know,
think that's true.
And that feels like so much of what's happening with not males specifically, but the masculine side of our nature within the culture, that it's losing its grip, and there is something feminine knocking at the door, and we don't know how to open it.
That's interesting.
You know, and I think your film really is touching on that. You know, there's a big temptation, obviously, with our background from Pacifica, to want to go in and analyze a story like this, but instead, my question to everyone who has seen it is not what did you like think of it, but what did you feel? Because that's what it left you at the end of it. What were you feeling as the lights go back on? And I was just wondering if we might get a couple responses from people, and we have to keep it very, very short, so just a quick response.
And we'll find some time during these 2 hours to directly open up to you guys.
Right. So anybody talk about just a quick note about feelings as you were experiencing the film, or as you felt as you were floating out of the theater.
Enchanted.
That's great.
That anything was possible.
Uh-huh.
It's a little bit of melancholy for me.
I would say so. Mhm. Any other
And
feelings?
beautiful.
Any feelings from the men here? My husband had a harder time with this film.
She had so much courage to start feeding the amphibian, you know, and I'm tempted to call the amphibian a monster, but he's not a monster.
We called him Fishman.
Fishman, fishman.
And I think you called the Strickland the monster.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, these are the kind of things that made you question. Yeah.
You know, and she was awake. Something in her was awakened,
Yeah.
and they did this where they kissed at the glass, and it was just so touching and so tender, and she kept tapping into a kind of a trickster energy to find off hours to go in there. And I just thought it was beautifully a good story, well told.
Well, and clearly, you know, thematically, however the theme wants to be described, it has to do with love. Okay, and so in terms also of feeling as you're moving through the story, was there anything about love itself that touched you as you were engaging in the film? Because even before the final poem, for me, it was really the reminder that love is all around us, that we are
That's what
literally
I felt.
swimming in it.
There's literally the words in my
And,
mind.
and that
yeah.
we forget. We forget, and we sequester ourselves and don't realize it's simply there.
May I read that poem?
Oh, please, yeah.
Unable to perceive the shape of you, I find you all around me. Your presence fills my eyes with your love. It humbles my heart, for you are everywhere.
It's amazing. Did you guys hear or read the story of how the poem came to be in the movie?
No, please tell
So
us.
Guillermo told this on a panel I was on. So he had this other poem, the one I kept trying to cut. And they were shooting in Toronto, and something happened, and somehow he ended up on set an hour or two early that day. And so he went into a bookshop, looked at a book, literally opened it to that page,
Stop it.
found this poem, and was like, oh, this is the poem, we're going to use it. It's astounding. It's so insane.
What did I put in here?
Is it a Rumi poem?
Yeah, I think it is, right?
Synchronicities made the story work, right?
It was
When
crazy.
the scientist and
Yeah.
without that those synchronistic overlaps,
Right.
the whole story doesn't work. And interesting to see synchronicity actually on the outside of the
So
story making it
insane.
work too.
It's just the craziest. But I do feel like there's something about Guillermo who is such a... He talks also about how, and I haven't gotten into the specifics of it with him, but that this movie came out of a very dark period in his life that he, I think creatively was feeling like he was maybe depleted or going in the wrong direction. And that this evolved from that he decided and really put a lot of his own a lot of his own personal resources behind his commitment to make this. And it really was a labor of love for him. And he made a lot of personal sacrifices to do it. And I feel like somehow the universe really responded to that.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just want to put a very fine point on this, because this goes to what we were just talking about, that art is a collaboration with the unknown.
Yeah.
And when you open yourselves truly to the depth of that collaboration, the book falls off the shelf.
Right.
No, it does. You know, it does. That is the collaboration with the unknown. And you know, any of you who are artists of any kind, writers or artists, you have all had experiences where you have, come up with something or encountered something, or just where it falls into place when you're left that open to it, you know?
Yeah, he really is. As I've said, he feels like a pure creative spirit to me. And I think that's why, we go to some of these award shows and we've gotten lots of nominations for things. But the one that we all really want is him winning. And he has been winning. But it's because we all, I think, feel that he took us on this journey with him that he was truly pure of heart. He's been incredibly generous with all of us in terms of just his collaboration and his inclusion. And so everybody sort of wants to see him rewarded for this. It's been really cool.
It really jumps out to me that you say this was inspired somewhat by a dark period in his life. We've been talking about synchronicity a little bit. Many people here are deeply versed in Carl Jung. And Carl Jung had a dark period in his life. And what came out of that, very famously, is the Red Book, which is this series that follows his transformation that's externalized into this art that shows his journey. And it's so interesting because the individuation journey is very much about finding this limited self, breaking it down, coming to engage with whatever is other to that limited self, and to expand the self into that other. And it's so interesting to see what very much is a journey of individuation. It leaps out of the story, but to know that it comes from a dark period in his life is really, really interesting.
Yeah.
I guess not surprising.
No, I have to say here, all art comes from a dark place. It is the feminine inner world. That's where new life is made, and it's where we process our pain, our hurt, our shame, all of that sort of stuff. And as we process it, we make something new into the world. We block it, becomes toxic. But if we don't, we release it. There it is.
So on this, one of the things that I haven't found it, but I'm sure what everybody's talking about is how well this story meditates on a relationship with otherness, with the other.
Yeah.
And so one of the things you see the movie and you know that, but I've watched the movie 3 times in the last 12 hours now, and it really, and it really jumps out. The amount of layers of other is astounding. Underwater, unconscious, minorities, the help below the line, the outmoded and unemployed, women, the Russians, the political enemies, the divine, the natural, negative thoughts that are repressed. That was wonderful. Anybody outside the system, anything that's not human, that's a thing or that's a quote freak. That every single one of those others had an arc within the story. That was what was the most beautiful display to me, is the successful blending of all these others into a story.
And that, I think, was very intentional on Guillermo's part, that he's an immigrant, so he has been grappling with this idea of the other for a long, long time, way before we were all talking about it. But I also think, he's talked about seeing Creature from the Black Lagoon and feeling this. And I think what he's sort of implying or sort of saying, I think he feels this real affinity for monsters and this sort of...
I went to his monsters exhibit.
Wasn't it amazing? It was incredible.
I gave my students bonus for going.
It was an incredible exhibit.
Yeah.
But I think he really feels this kinship and this, I don't think it's just the fact that he's an immigrant that makes him feel other. I think he has always felt sort of other. And so I think it was his intention not only to tell that story about the creature in the story, but to have everyone echo that story. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Do you think that he wished that the Creature from the Black Lagoon would have had a happy ending?
Oh, he talks about that. He thought they were going to get together. He was like, oh, this is like this love story and this is how this is going to work. And then he was like, what? Like, I was like, huh?
So this is rewriting history.
Exactly.
Wow. Interesting. But that's narrative healing. That's, that's like when a culture gets a story, because basically when they don't come together, the psychological experience of that is that you don't develop a relationship with the other. And so when you take that, you can heal that whole psychological experience by inverting that story. And
he talks about that feeling, and then he, I think, waited and waited to find a story that would be appropriate to hang that on. And he was having coffee with this guy who I now know, who's this lovely, I don't really remember what their relationship is outside of this, but they were talking about some other ideas, and Daniel mentioned the idea he had, which was a janitor working at the lab, I guess. And Guillermo was like, that's it. I'm buying that from you. I'm going to make this.
Whoa! Wow.
Yeah, he just recognized, like, oh, that's the way I'm going to be able to tell this story. Yeah.
Wow. And then I mean, and it's not just, you know, this other. It's built out into this repression. The repression is repeated. The beating of the mermaid, the creature. The negative thoughts are repressed. The changing of the channel and during the Black Rights March. The ignoring of the scientist, which we experience now. The wife that's silenced.
Yep.
The non-human. When the artist says, "We will not even talk about this. It's not even human."
Right.
And of course, the homosexuality. So it's not just that there's an other worked in. The
Right.
the repression and the oppression is
Yes,
really
and I
worked
think
out.
he's very consciously sort of commenting on that.
Yeah, and I think that may be a big part. I think part of what you were getting to
Yes.
with the current time.
Yes.
I think that's a big part of what
Yeah.
struck.
I do too.
Yeah.
Do you think that attributes some of the reason why there's such positive feedback and
Oh,
such
absolutely.
success?
I absolutely
I
do.
think so. Yeah.
I absolutely do.
And the
People
symbolism
really relate to
developed
that.
around that was spectacular. The hand, the lightning rod,
Yeah.
you know, Zeusian oppressive symbol. Okay, of course we're mythologists here. We have to say the lightning rod. You know,
Well,
we
and it's
gotta bring it
all
up.
over the place. Like his visual elements. I mean, the fact that he color coded the whole movie, and so her place is blue, and then her wallpaper has
Oh.
like these scales, and you don't see blue anywhere else except around her. And then green represents the future, and you see it with the car and the Jello and everything else. And then red, you only see.
But it's
with
not a green
her.
car, it's a teal car.
Right, it's a teal car. But red you only see with her. You see it in the end, and you see the
Interesting.
blood, and you see
The
he did it.
shoes.
Oh, right.
He did it on
right.
each side, right? So he bleeds from one side, she bleeds from the other side. Like
Oh.
he is incredibly thoughtful about all of
I
these
thought
sort
I
of
noticed a few of
visual
those
elements.
details,
I mean,
but-
it. Well, I didn't obviously know either, and then I sit next time on these panels, and I'm like, wow, this is like a crazy masterclass that I keep being next to Guillermo and hearing all his. I mean, it's really pretty incredible.
I don't want to move off the question of other. If you guys have some thoughts, I feel like that was one of the meatiest things in the story, and it's something that we as mythologists and depth psychologists deal with a lot. A lot of stories are about this journey into the other and coming back from the unconscious, from the underworld, from depression, from whatever that other world and the other place. What was so beautifully done is there wasn't just this personification of other, but one thing I loved is the way that he brings the whole other world back with him. They fill the room with the water, and then the final redemption in the end is the rain. So it's not just he brings his world starts to come in with it, and that was really nice to see.
Yeah.
And I thought jump in on other stuff, but one thing that jumped out to me was hilarious was the general. He said, "Oh, it's bigger than I thought," because we normally diminuate the other. There's not many others. We are the whole thing, you know.
Yeah.
Kind of. That cracked me up. But interesting about him is that he, quote, saw her for who she was.
Right.
And she wasn't an other to him. And to
Yeah.
be somebody that's always seen as an other,
Right.
to not be seen as an other,
Right. But in fact, the opposite, to be recognized as we
Yeah.
are somehow the same.
yeah, to feel unexcluded in that moment. Yeah.
Do you see her as a hero? I mean, to me, she embodies the aspects of being a hero because she is doing something that nobody else has the courage to do, which is establish a relationship with the amphibian or your fish man, if you will, and to pursue it, to actively seek to give him his freedom.
I guess, honestly, I mean, obviously she is sort of the hero of this movie. I see her more as a person who's acting in authenticity when some around her are struggling with that. And because, for her friend Giles to help her, for the scientist to help, for her friend Zelda to help, it costs them all something. Whereas for her, I think her genuine desire is to be with him. It doesn't really occur to her not to help. She doesn't really seem fearful of the consequences, although there could be consequences.
And she inspires all the others.
Yeah, so in some ways I don't see her so much as a hero character, just because her actions seem so
So genuine.
So genuine and so destined and so sort of what she genuinely wants to do. She's just not sort of struggling with it, I guess, in the way I see heroes struggle. She's really like, this is what we're doing.
You know, I'm saying this not because it's a female character, but when you were asking about the hero's journey, and your answer was very, very interesting, because this is how we tend to define hero in a very masculine context. You know, do they win the prize,
Right.
and are they victorious,
Right.
and so on. And the feminine heroic is a different animal altogether, because as you pointed out, it's authentic. It's not fighting for a prize.
that's right.
It's fighting, you know, for the whole self.
Right.
To make something whole, to make something meaningful.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Well, and it gives her a guiding purpose.
Right. That's right.
Well, it's not an ego that motivates her heroism. It's some very deep.
There's almost a
Yeah.
religious impulse.
Yeah, I mean, it's like she has no choice. She doesn't really, I think, stop to think, like, will I do this or won't I do this? It's just, I'm going to do this.
Right, that's the authentic note
It's
right
actually
there.
sort of interesting. So this is an interesting part of our process that I think has to do with this. So in the midst of all these drafts going back and forth, there's a moment in the movie where they say, basically, we're going to kill this creature. Then there's a moment where she decides she's going to rescue the creature, and she goes and appeals to her neighbor for help. In many versions of this script, she has no idea that they're going to kill this creature. She just knows that they're hurting him. And yet it's chronologically, they say they're going to kill him, and then she decides to help. So finally, this is one of the only questions I actually emailed Guillermo and said, I need to know the answer to this question. I don't understand. This thing happens. Do you truly not want her to know that it happened? Like, the audience knows they're going to kill him. This is a reason why she would want to help. Shouldn't she know that? And that will cause her to want to help. And his answer was interesting to me. It was sort of like, well, she could know it, but she already knows they're hurting him. And I was like, what? Like, I was so confounded, because it's the normal thing that, like, we need to inspire her to help. We will do that by saying that the stakes are really high. And he was sort of like, I don't care about that. Like, we already know why she's going to help. And so ultimately they did put in something where she hears it on the stairway or something. And that, I think, was probably the influence of somebody other than him, like the studio or whatever. But I thought it was such an intriguing, like, it just really turned my brain around, because I was like, there's no universe in which I understand a story where we have this information, she doesn't have it, and she could use. But for him, it was just an entirely other question.
You know, it is interesting, because if you took out her knowing, he actually is right.
Yeah.
We completely bought into
Right,
her.
we still are like,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
they're being really mean to him.
Right.
Like, it's horrible.
Yeah.
But it was such a weird, like, disconnect between what I was like, this is the bedrock of how stories are told. And he was sort of like, you know, like, that's not necessary.
It's like drawing stems beneath Monet's leaves. Why
Right,
would draw
it was like,
stems
why?
beneath the leaves?
Like,
You know?
yeah.
Interesting. Well, I wanted to ask you about, when one of your interviews, you mentioned that theme is a big deal to you. And you mentioned that it's been relatively recent in your work that you've started translating themes a lot more, in a more focused way on visual expression. I was wondering if you could speak to what that's like for you to translate theme into visuals, and maybe there are a couple examples.
There probably are not examples. I can never think of examples.
Sorry.
So theme has always been a way for me to focus work. So, for instance, if you think about it, like any scene, aside from what you need the scene to accomplish, it could be anything. Like, I need this person to ask this other person on a date. But everybody around them and everything around them could be anything. And that's kind of overwhelming. But if you're on a theme, now you've got sort of a focusing principle, right? Like, okay, well, you know, we're on this theme of loneliness or whatever, and so everything is going to contribute to that. So now I have a way to choose things that I didn't have before. But for me, it was always sort of auditory. It was about what people were saying. And as I've gotten more into film work, I've just come to see it more. And I think I've also become less dependent on dialogue, simply because, you know, that's just not always the way these stories are told. And so in the way that theme was informing my dialogue, sometimes it's now also informing what I'm seeing as I am seeing more. And you know, you have to be really careful because you're not supposed to direct on the page. That's like a big faux pas. But you are supposed to sort of color it in a little bit. And sometimes I think theme can help you with that.
And so, what does that look like for you when it translates into a visual? Do you mean like, you know, the color of light, or do you mean like an image, or like the words on a poster? What are you thinking about?
I think it would be like, for instance, where you would set something or who you would have in a scene, like how it actually sort of frames out in terms of things have a visual feel to them. So something can have warmth, or it can be colder. It can, you know, point to different emotions. So the way you frame out a scene, and again, what you need a scene to accomplish is often very small.
Right.
So what's around it visually and in terms of dialogue and everything else you're locating there is often almost arbitrary. And so to be able to choose in a more focused way, I think I'm just giving things a little more consistency and cohesion that traditionally come from the director and, you know, will again later down the line come from the director. But I'm putting them in at a slightly earlier stage now, more so than I used to.
So it sounds like these are relatively nuanced kind of details, more than like injecting a major symbolic expression.
Yeah,
or
no,
something.
it's not
Right.
usually something like that for me, and it may be for the director who then reads the pages and translates them. But for me, it's more simply the choices you're making and the things you're excluding from those choices. I'm making it now around sort of the thematic material.
Thanks.
It seems that your character of Strickland, you just had a field day with this guy. I mean, reading Norman Vincent Peale, buying
This
the
is actually an
Cadillac.
interesting point. So this script has had a long life, and I was on this script for about 6 months. I probably did 6 or 7 drafts of it. But Guillermo then continued to rewrite as he moved toward production. And the Strickland character, during the time when I was on it, was darker. So
Darker than he was?
Yeah.
He's a pretty dark character.
He's a dark guy, but he was less. He wasn't reading that book. He wasn't sort of. He was more straight ahead dark. He wasn't sort of attempting to be something else, or I think that probably that was a conscious choice to not exactly lighten him, but to give him sort of some different colors. And I completely understand why you would do that. At the same time, I really liked him just dark. For some reason, that was sort of my taste. And I sort of saw him as this really benighted kind of guy who was just this sort of dark person, but who was kind of losing the war. And I felt really bad for him and sad for him. So I didn't have a problem with how dark he was, because I also felt this big pity for him. But that bit of levity in his character, that bit of sort of, that was not my addition. And it was something, honestly, I sort of related to less.
What about the son and his the dinner table? The son.
So again, I had sort of different versions of those scenes where, for me, it was again about that chatter that means nothing, and they were all sort of chattering about, they had just moved there, and the wife was talking about aspects of living there and the Jell-O. A lot of it was about the Jell-O, and you know, they've got these new flavors and blah 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 blah. While things were happening to him, I thought it was interesting, and this is sort of a question or issue I've had quite a few times as I now think back on it. So here's a guy who's evil, whether he's reading that book or not. He's a horrible, horrible, terrible person. He's married to a woman, and this is 1962. So it's easy for me to believe she just got stuck. You know what I mean? Now she's stuck. She doesn't have a job, so she's not going to leave him. But in my versions of her, she was not seducing him. Because I felt like I'm okay with the fact that someone's married to this guy. And I'm even okay with the fact that she wants to make him Jell-O or whatever else. She's trying to make the best life for herself she can. But once she's actively thinking he's cool, I'm more confused by who that character is.
More like a wish fulfillment.
Yeah, and I often have this gender issue, which I think that I'm not sure that men who are creating these characters always understand what those choices mean about those women. That once you do that to her, she doesn't feel to me as real a person.
I had exactly the same feeling. It was one of the few beats in the film for me that didn't quite feel authentic. Also, his relationship with his son.
Yeah.
Now, I could believe that his son wanted something from him, but the way that they interacted, if you just took that shot by itself, it felt like they had a good relationship somewhere in there.
Yeah.
And I
right.
couldn't quite
and
buy
I
that.
think these things were changes made to lighten his character a little bit. But in my mind, I felt like we see in the end who this guy is. We're never going to really lighten him. There's no lightness there.
Right.
So I was sort of okay with him just being... I thought it was really interesting, sort of how he talked and his weird thing with his fingers. I thought, okay, I'm okay. That's... And I think it was probably less interesting for someone like Michael Shannon, who's actually been asked to play versions of that character many, many times. So I could understand also this being a sort of slightly... but for me, I less related to a slightly lighter version of the character.
Do you think it helped embed him in like the 50s fantasy more to have a wife and son like that? Like, that was my experience, because I also didn't find it believable, but I didn't think it was supposed to be. I thought it was supposed to be like, here is 50s fantasy that we're breaking.
Well, again, I think there's ways to have these people, you know, they're living one life and he's living another, right? They don't know that he has this top secret asset that he's now lost and is in big trouble and all these things. They know that they've moved to this city and he's this kind of weird absent dad and, so I think you can do both. Yeah.
Okay.
I think you can also have a man who has a higher opinion of himself than who he really is.
Yeah, of course.
With aspirations.
Which is why he reads the Norman
That's
Appeal,
exactly
which was
right.
sort of like a seminal tome of that particular era.
Right.
Why don't we see if anybody...
I was going to go 10 more minutes exactly, if that's okay.
Okay.
And then that'll give us half an hour for Q&A. And then I'll let you guys know ahead of time, we're going to ask these three young women filmmakers if they'd like to come up and take Dana and I's place to ask Vanessa a little bit about what it's like to be a woman in this industry. So we've got a plan. We'll do that. There are just a couple other questions that a couple pieces that I was hoping we could engage in. And I'm sure there are a couple more things on Dara's list too. But one of the things I really wanted to know are how much did you connect with her gills being a wound? That the idea that her opening into the other was through this wound, that was only through what was perceived as a wound that she opened.
Well, it was perceived as a wound.
Right.
But they were surmising what happened to her. Whereas I just thought from the beginning, these are gills that are sort of...
Tell me what the truth is. What's really going on?
Well, I don't... Look, Guillermo is the only one who knows the truth of this story, right? But in my mind, they had always been gills that were sort of... Whatever, they had receded somehow or something. So he assumed it was a wound, but it wasn't. That was sort of my take on it, was that they just didn't understand that she had come from somewhere else and was going back somewhere else.
Cool. Okay, cool. I was always fascinated when I found out that hiccups have basically the same electrical signal in the brain as breathing with gills. And there's no reason why we would hiccup. It does nothing for us.
Interesting.
So people speculate it
It's
may
like
be a
this-
vestige of our...
Right. Yeah, I thought it was like vestigial gills.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I had to ask about the gills, and I'm sorry that I wasn't willing to turn it over to you guys until I did. There's endless stuff. I want to ask about every symbol. I want to know about the egg, and I want to know about...
I want to know about the egg.
Okay,
where does the inspiration for the egg come from?
Okay, this,
Egg.
and now I've tried not to do this, but I have to do this on this one. The egg
Okay.
was all Guillermo. It showed up before I did. He had it all over the place, and he, I think,
All
has
over it,
talked
yeah.
about it in interviews, but like, and even, so this is how, like, square I was in the beginning. I was like, okay, so she has an egg timer. So are you implying that she needs longer than she has? Like, does it normally take her longer? If so, why doesn't the egg timer go off? Do you know what I mean? Like, and she should not have finished in the bathtub because what I was just mystified by this timer. Like, I couldn't figure out, like, okay, so you do this every single day in your bathtub, but you don't have a sense of how long it's going to take. And the timer was part of the whole egg thing and the symbolism of the egg. And I think it is sort of life and all that. But he, from the very, very beginning, the image of those eggs boiling and her giving him the egg, I mean, it was always.
Interesting.
There was a lot that, like, a lot of the story wasn't entirely there, but this imagery from the very beginning, all the stuff about the dancing and the TV and the music and all that stuff, and that, is tone, right? He knew the tone of it from the very beginning, and the egg was like a huge part of it. By the way, we were recently, just this weekend, we were at the BAFTA Awards in London, and at the dinner they had table settings that were specific to your movie, and our table setting was like this crazy, the three billboards obviously was like a billboard and obvious, and then at our table there was this weird, like, it was like a glass thing full of eggs, and then at one of the luncheons we went to, they had like an egg, nobody else had an egg, and we were all like, so weird, like, we're like the egg people. Strange.
Well, I mean, because when you boil an egg, you're preventing it from hatching, right? And she's masturbating, which is to not procreate, So the symbol is thick, and then finally, because she goes into the water, into the bathtub, at the same time the egg goes into the pot. So there's this, like, mimesis. And then later, finally, when she goes into the water at the end, it's after she's been procreating, and we can assume that this Ouroboros, like, unfertility is now open.
Interesting.
And she's... Yeah.
I am sure that if Guillermo was here, he'd be like, exactly. Whereas I'm like, okay, I guess so.
Or he might just go, it's just an egg.
It happens. It certainly does. Yeah. Well, do you guys have a couple last thoughts or questions before we turn it over to our group mind?
I think you've been very generous in your responses and open, and it's wonderful.
Thank you.
I just want to know about the final season of Game of Thrones. I'm sorry.
Interestingly, I have not watched a single episode since I left the show.
Oh, really?
It's
very good.
I've heard it's very good. I left because I wanted to live here full time, and I had to live in Belfast for 3 or 4 months a year when I was on the show. And so that was a reason that was compelling for me, but I found it so painful to leave. Like, I really hated leaving, and so I just never watched it again. And it was funny because, again, at one of these I think it was like the AFI luncheon, they were honoring TV shows as well, and they showed little clips of everything. I saw this clip of Thrones, and I was like, what? Like, it was like Daenerys with this gigantic dragon, and a friend of mine does all the VFX for the show, and he was like, oh, it's gotten much harder since you left. And I'm like, oh my god, it has! Like, the dragon is the entire screen. I was like, wow, this has really changed. Anyway.
Final question. Did you, I really love the show Alias too. I thought
Me too, I loved it.
It seemed, for its time, I mean, it really broke some boundaries, and it
fun.
really, It was quite delightful.
It was a blast, and it was my favorite pilot that year by far. I thought it was terrific. It was actually the hardest show I've ever worked on, in the sense that I was very unsuited to it. And I was unsuited to the culture of it, because it ended up being a writer's room, primarily men who had played video games and came from that culture.
Okay.
And I just felt like, I don't know what anyone's talking about. I thought this was going to be like, like John le Carré. That was my plan. And then I got there and was just like, I don't know what anyone's saying. Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, originally when I approached Vanessa, it was all about Game of Thrones. And you came back from the film festival in Canada, and this Shape of Water began to gain momentum. And so we had set this date. And as you know, the Academy Awards are a week from Sunday. And as the Game of Thrones slipped away and this slipped into its place, I got, how are we going to possibly hold you on this? Because I can only imagine that, your dance card is really filled.
It's been a busy time.
You just must be thrilled with the response that this movie has had.
And the more I see of the awards process, the more I realize the word campaign, like, they mean it. People are campaigning, and that means that some deserving films get acknowledged and some deserving films don't. And and what that all means to me is it's very capricious. Like, you are lucky to be involved, and you take that luck and grab onto it, but, like, that's about all you can kind of take from it, because it's a very, very random, like, it's a very strange and random process, and who knew? But it's been very educational.
But because he is largely an entrepreneur in a studio industry, is he actively campaigning?
Guillermo?
Yeah.
You think my dance card is full. That guy's at a Q&A every night. I mean, he is everywhere.
Actually, there was some talk about him coming. I don't know if I can say this, but he was talking about maybe coming to do a screening of Shape of Water Pacifica. And I don't know what happened to that.
I mean, that man has just been. He's also incredibly generous with his time. I don't think he's campaigning because he's a super political, I want to win guy.
Yeah.
When we do Q&As, he stands there until the last person has asked their question.
I've got a student, his name is Nando, and twice he's tried to get into a panel, and he's been late, and so is Del Toro, and he's walked in twice now with my student sitting out there not able to get in, and he's ended up talking with him, and he stopped and was extremely generous and spoke with them and offered to come speak at the school with an event it meant so much to that student, the world.
He's always
to that
like
student.
that. He's just incredibly so I think he's exhausted because people just ask and he just says yes, but I think he is so thrilled with the response that he's like, great, yes, take it and run with it.
Well, you got a room full of people pulling for you in a week. Thank you so much. We're so grateful.